Okay, so you want to own a McDonald's. You've seen the drive-through line wrap around the building at lunch, watched the register ring non-stop for 3 straight hours, and done the math in your head. Thousands of transactions a day, thousands of locations across the country, a brand so strong that people will drive past 2 other burger joints just to get here. You think, this has to be one of the safest bets in business. Here is where most people stop thinking, and here is exactly where the real story begins. Because owning a McDonald's is nothing like owning a restaurant. It is closer to signing a 20-year contract with a landlord who also happens to be your boss, your supplier, your regulator, and your biggest competitor for your own profit. And the biggest twist of all is this. The burgers are almost incidental to how McDonald's Corporation actually makes its money, and once you understand that, everything about franchise ownership starts to make a strange kind of sense. Let's start with what it costs to even get in the room. In the United States, opening a single McDonald's requires somewhere between $1.4 and $2.7 million, covering equipment, renovation, signage, initial inventory, training, and a one-time franchise fee of $45,000 just for the right to put the golden arches on your building. And here is the detail that trips up almost every first-time applicant. You cannot finance the whole amount. McDonald's requires that at least $500,000 of that total be unborrowed, liquid, personal cash sitting in your account before they will even discuss a location with you. That is not a loan qualification. That is proof that you are not a person trying to gamble your way into the system on someone else's money. Outside the United States, the price shifts dramatically depending on where you look. In the United Kingdom, a full restaurant runs between roughly 1 and 1.7 million euros. In Germany, the number sits closer to 1.4 million euros. In Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, you can get into the system for around 1 million euros, meaning the exact same amount of capital that buys you 1 restaurant in America could open 2 restaurants somewhere else entirely. But money alone does not guarantee access. In India, McDonald's does not sell licenses to individuals at all. The entire country is split between 2 master franchise companies, one controlling the north and east, the other controlling the south and west. Across Latin America, a single company called Arcos Dorados controls the McDonald's brand in 21 countries. No matter how much cash you are carrying, you cannot walk in and negotiate directly with the corporation there. At best, you become a sub-franchisee underneath an existing monopoly, paying fees not just to McDonald's but to the middleman standing between you and the parent company. Let's say you decide the United States is worth the premium, since it is the biggest and most prestigious market in the system. You have your $2 million, you are ready to sign, and then you get rejected, not because of your finances, but because you have not passed selection. This is where McDonald's stops behaving like every other franchise on earth. Most franchise systems work on a simple principle. If you have the capital, you get the contract. McDonald's flips that logic entirely. Before they will hand you a restaurant, you have to prove you deserve to stand next to the brand, and they do not test that in an interview. They test it on the floor. Every candidate, regardless of net worth, is required to work inside an existing McDonald's for 6 to 12 months. Unpaid if done full-time at 35 hours a week, or stretched out over 10 to 12 months if done part-time. That means the person with $2 million sitting in the bank is expected to put on the same uniform as a 17-year-old employee, work the fryer, run the register, and scrub the same bathrooms for months without a paycheck. At the same time, candidates are sent through what McDonald's genuinely and seriously calls Hamburger University, its internal training campus in Chicago, where owners learn food cost calculations, staff scheduling for crews of 60 or more employees, and inventory management, ending in a formal exam. And passing that exam still does not guarantee you a restaurant, because for every available location, there are dozens of qualified applicants, and the final decision rests with a single person, the regional field vice president, who is weighing your finances against your biography, your reputation, and how you behave during those unpaid months on the floor. At this point, it would be easy to assume the system only rewards people who already have connections. But consider Vijay Selhi, who arrived in the United States from a small village in India in 1983, with no money, no network, and limited English. He took a minimum wage cashier job at a McDonald's in Somerville, Massachusetts, working night shifts for years before climbing to shift leader, then manager, then territorial supervisor. It took him 32 years of steady advancement before he had the capital and the reputation to buy his first 2 restaurants in 2015, one of which was the very location where he had started as a teenager behind the register decades earlier. Today, he and his sons own 19 McDonald's locations. That is the slow path. The faster path, and the one most new owners actually take, is buying an existing restaurant from someone already inside the system who wants out. And right now, there are more owners looking to exit than at almost any point in the last several decades. To understand why, you have to look at what happened in December of 2020, when McDonald's sent an email to its franchise network raising technology fees, cutting the subsidy that had offset the cost of Happy Meals, and adding new mandatory payments. Altogether, that added roughly $12,000 in new annual cost per restaurant, and with more than 13,000 McDonald's locations operating in the United States, that single email pulled close to $170 million out of franchisee pockets in one move. The response was unlike anything in the chain's 70-year history. 95% of franchise owners voted to pause communication with the corporation entirely, ignoring directives and slowing internal operations in protest. The pressure eventually produced something called the Franchisee Bill of Rights, signed in January of 2026, a 15-point document limiting what the corporation is allowed to impose on its owners. The centerpiece being the right to set your own menu prices without corporate override, so that an owner paying steep rent and wages in Manhattan cannot be forced to sell an $8 Big Mac for $6 just because headquarters says so. But price control disputes are not the only fights happening inside the system. George Michel, a franchisee since 1990, who eventually built a portfolio of 37 restaurants generating around $158 million in annual revenue, invested $20 million into corporate-mandated renovations, only to have McDonald's decline to renew his contracts and offer to buy his restaurants back at well below market value. When his daughter separately applied for her own franchise license, she was denied, with the implication that approval depended on her father agreeing to sell off a large portion of his restaurants voluntarily. Michel filed a federal lawsuit alleging racial discrimination, a case that remains ongoing. He was not the first to make that claim. Herbert Washington, once the largest black franchisee in the system with 27 restaurants, spent years in litigation with the corporation before McDonald's eventually purchased 13 of his locations for $33.5 million on the condition that he exit the system and drop the lawsuit. These are not isolated anecdotes. They are the visible edge of a structural reality, that the landlord, the brand licensor, and the final arbiter of your business's future are all the same entity, and that entity's incentives do not always run parallel to yours. So let's actually run the numbers, because this is where the fantasy of easy franchise money collides with arithmetic. Once you finally hold the keys, you owe McDonald's 4 separate recurring payments every single month. The land and the building almost always belong to the corporation, not to you, and rent typically runs between 8 and 18% of your total revenue, though in premium locations that figure can climb as high as 31.75%, meaning nearly a third of everything your restaurant earns walks straight back to the landlord before you touch a dollar of it. On top of rent sits a royalty fee of 4% of revenue for the right to use the brand, a separate marketing fee of another 4% funding McDonald's global advertising, and a technology fee covering point-of-sale systems, the mobile app, and required software, running around $5,000 per restaurant annually and rising every year. None of these numbers looks devastating in isolation. Stacked together, they reshape the entire business. Take a restaurant generating the network average of around $4 million in annual revenue. The corporation's combined take through rent, royalty, and marketing alone runs to roughly $800,000. Food costs, wages for a staff of 60, utilities, taxes, and technology fees consume another $2.9 million. What remains, after a $2 million upfront investment, is somewhere around $300,000 a year in net income, meaning it takes 6 to 7 years of daily operation just to earn back your original capital. In European markets, the net income tends to land between 150 and 250,000 euros annually, with a similar 5 to 7 year payback window. And then comes the scenario nobody budgets for. Around year 6, right as you are finally breaking even, McDonald's declines to renew your 20-year contract, sometimes for the same underlying disputes that Michelle and Washington fought over, and offers to buy the restaurant back at around 70% of its market value. Everything you spent years building transfers to the corporation at a discount. It is in that exact moment that the alternative becomes impossible to ignore. Over the past 20 years, McDonald's Corporation stock has risen by roughly 700%. The same $2 million that bought you one restaurant, one lease you don't control, one contract you can lose, and a year of unpaid floor work to even qualify for it, would have grown into $16 million simply sitting in shares. No selection process, no hamburger university, no scrubbing toilets for free, just ownership of the machine itself, instead of one small, replaceable piece standing underneath it.